December 18, 1944, Pöllitz, Pomerania, Eastern Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered through the frozen air at 23,000 feet. Second Lieutenant James Keller pressed his forehead against the plexiglass nose cone, watching the industrial sprawl materialize through breaks in the cloud cover. Below, the Hydrierwerke Pöllitz synthetic oil plant stretched across the landscape like a mechanical city, its towers and cooling units connected by a maze of pipelines that glinted in the winter light. This was the 398th Bomb Group's fourth mission against Pöllitz in 6 weeks. Keller had studied the reconnaissance photographs until he could navigate the facility in his sleep. The coal gasification units, the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis towers, the hydrogenation chambers, where pressurized coal became liquid fuel through chemistry that seemed closer to alchemy than engineering. Intelligence officers said this single plant provided 12% of Germany's aviation gasoline. Without it, the Luftwaffe would be grounded within months. The flak began at 10 miles out. Black puffs of 88mm shells erupted in precise patterns, German gunners adjusting their range with methodical efficiency. The formation tightened. Keller counted 19 fortresses around him, each carrying 4,000 pounds of high explosives. Through his headset came the rhythmic confirmation of the bombardier. On target, steady. Then the bombs fell away and the aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter. Keller watched the string of explosions walk across the refinery complex, each detonation sending columns of black smoke spiraling upward. Fires bloomed among the distillation towers. Secondary explosions rippled through the storage tanks. The mission report would call it a success. But Keller knew the truth that ate at every bomber crew over Germany. Within weeks, the damage would be repaired. The Nazis had dispersed their synthetic fuel production across dozens of sites, buried some underground, camouflaged others in forests and valleys. The Reich produced more than 4 million tons of synthetic fuel in 1944, extracted from coal through a process developed by German chemists in the 1920s. It was industrial resilience on a scale the Allied planners hadn't fully comprehended. 3 days later, Keller sat in a briefing room at RAF Bury St. Edmunds, studying new intelligence photographs. A captain from the Ministry of Economic Warfare spread the images across the table. These weren't taken from bomber altitude, he said, tapping a photograph of what looked like a river valley carved into forested mountains. We intercepted Wehrmacht communications referring to it as Anlage B-XII. We believe it's a new underground hydrogenation plant in the Harz Mountains near Nordhausen. Keller leaned closer. The photographs showed a valley floor that appeared normal at first glance, but the shadows were wrong. Rectangular depressions in the earth, camouflage netting stretched between trees, railroad tracks that disappeared into hillsides, and in one corner of the photograph, barely visible through the forest canopy, something that looked like massive concrete ventilation shafts. How much fuel could this produce? Someone asked. The captain's expression didn't change. If it's operational, enough to extend the war by 6 months, maybe longer. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. 6 more months of bombers shot down over Germany. 6 more months of soldiers dying in frozen foxholes. 6 more months for the Reich to perfect its jet aircraft, its V-2 rockets, perhaps even the atomic weapons intelligence suggested they were pursuing. There's a problem, the captain continued. He laid down another photograph, this one showing a fortified mountain entrance. We can't bomb it effectively. Too much rock overhead, too well dispersed. We'd need to send a ground team in to assess the facility and identify vulnerabilities. And we'd need to do it before the Wehrmacht realizes we know it exists. Keller found himself staring at the photographs long after the briefing ended. The images showed a landscape of shadows and secrets, a hidden industrial complex that represented everything desperate and brilliant about Germany's war economy. They had built an empire on synthetic fuel when the world thought it impossible. Now, somewhere under those mountains, they were betting everything on one final production surge. That night, Keller was called to the commanding officer's quarters. 2 men in civilian clothes waited there, speaking in low voices about insertion points and extraction windows. They asked if he could read German, if he understood industrial processes, if he was willing to volunteer for something that wouldn't appear in any official record. Through the window behind them, Keller could see the hardstands where B-17s sat silent in the darkness, waiting for morning and the next mission. Somewhere beyond the North Sea, beyond the shattered cities and burning refineries, a hidden valley held secrets that could change the trajectory of the war. He said yes before they finished explaining. January 9th, 1945. Nordhausen region, Harz Mountains, Germany. The reconnaissance team moved through the forest in darkness, their boots crunching softly on frozen snow. Keller had been on the ground in Germany for 11 days, though it felt like months. His uniform had been replaced with civilian work clothes. His identification papers claimed he was a displaced Polish laborer. The OSS officer leading the team, a man who called himself Fischer, spoke perfect German and moved with the casual confidence of someone who had done this many times before. They had crossed the lines near Aachen, traveled by night through the Thuringian forest, and spent 3 days observing the valley from the surrounding ridges. What they saw confirmed the intelligence assessment. This was no ordinary synthetic fuel plant. The scale of the operation was staggering. The valley had been transformed into an industrial fortress. Railroad spurs disappeared into tunnel entrances large enough to accommodate entire trains. Ventilation shafts disguised as natural rock formations dotted the mountainsides. At night, the sound of machinery echoed from beneath the earth, a deep mechanical rumble that seemed to make the ground itself vibrate. And there were workers, hundreds of them, filing in and out of the tunnels at shift changes. From their hollow expressions and striped clothing, Keller understood these were concentration camp prisoners, worked until they collapsed. Fischer had made contact with a Czech engineer who had been forced to help construct the facility. They met in the ruins of a bombed-out farmhouse, the engineer chain-smoking cigarettes with trembling hands while he sketched diagrams on scraps of paper. They call it the Emergency Fuel Initiative. Underground hydrogenation chambers built into natural limestone caves. The entire system is 3 kilometers long, 50 meters below the surface. They pump coal slurry from rail cars directly into pressure vessels. The Fischer-Tropsch process runs continuously. Output capacity is classified, but I've seen the manifolds. This facility could produce 5,000 barrels per day once fully operational. Keller did the mathematics in his head. 5,000 barrels daily meant enough aviation gasoline to fuel hundreds of sorties, enough to sustain the Luftwaffe through the spring, enough to matter. "When does it reach full production?" Fischer asked. The engineer's cigarette trembled. 3 weeks, maybe 4. They're rushing the final testing phase. Safety protocols are being ignored. The pressure vessels weren't designed for continuous operation at these temperatures, but Berlin demands results. That was when Fischer made the decision. They wouldn't just gather intelligence and leave. They would sabotage the facility. The plan was simple and suicidal. The engineer provided security passes and work assignments that would get them inside during the next shift change. They would carry small explosive charges disguised as toolboxes, plant them near the main pressure regulators. The resulting explosion wouldn't destroy the facility, but it would cascade through the hydrogenation chambers, creating fires that would burn for weeks. On January 14th, Keller walked through the main tunnel entrance alongside 200 exhausted prisoners. SS guards checked papers at the gate, but barely looked at faces. Inside, the tunnel opened into a massive underground chamber, lit by harsh electric lights. The noise was overwhelming. The roar of pressure pumps, the hiss of steam vents, the clang of tools against metal. The air tasted of coal dust and chemical solvents. They reached the pressure regulator station at the facility's center. This was the heart of the operation, where liquid coal slurry was transformed into synthetic gasoline through heat, pressure, and catalytic chemistry. The engineer had been right. The equipment looked stressed. Pressure gauges showed readings in the red zones. Pipes vibrated with barely contained force. Fisher placed the charges with practiced efficiency, hiding them among the valve assemblies. 15-minute fuses, enough time to reach the surface and disappear into the forest before the explosion. But as they turned to leave, a German supervisor appeared, flanked by 2 guards. He stared at Keller with sudden recognition. "Zu," he said in German, "I've seen you before." Keller's mind raced. He couldn't place the man. Had they crossed paths at Politz, at another bombing target? The supervisor stepped closer, suspicion hardening in his eyes. Fisher moved first. The suppressed pistol barely made a sound, just a mechanical snap that was lost in the industrial noise. The supervisor collapsed. The guards reached for their weapons, but never drew them. 3 shots, 3 bodies. "Run," Fisher said. They ran, shoving through the crowd of workers, ignoring the shouts behind them. The tunnel seemed endless. The entrance was a circle of gray winter light that grew slowly larger. Behind them, whistles began to blow. They burst into daylight as the first alarm sirens wailed. The forest was 200 meters away across open ground. Guards poured from the tunnel entrance. Bullets snapped past, kicking up snow. They reached the tree line as the explosion came. Not the small detonation they'd planned, but something massive and catastrophic. The ground heaved. A fireball erupted from the tunnel entrance, followed by a rolling wave of pressure that knocked them off their feet. The engineer had been right about the safety margins. The charges had triggered a cascade failure in the overstressed pressure systems. From the forest, Keller watched the valley fill with fire. Secondary explosions rippled through the underground chambers. Ventilation shafts became chimneys spewing flame and smoke. The rumble continued for minutes, punctuated by detonations that sent shockwaves through the mountains. By dawn, the valley was a crematorium. The synthetic fuel that was supposed to extend the war had instead consumed itself, along with the facility, the machinery, and everyone who hadn't escaped the tunnels in time. Intelligence would later estimate that Germany lost 3 months of strategic fuel production in those 15 minutes. But Keller never filed an official report. The mission remained classified for decades. The bodies were never recovered. The prisoners who died in the flames were never counted. He crossed back into Allied lines on January 21, 1945. The war would end 4 months later. The synthetic fuel program would be studied by Allied scientists, its chemical processes copied, its industrial methods analyzed. But the hidden valley in the Harz Mountains remained a crater in the forest, a grave for secrets that burned too hot to survive. Years later, Keller would sometimes wake from dreams of tunnels and fire. He'd remember the sound of machinery beneath the earth, the desperate innovation of a dying regime, and the terrible mathematics of war that measured victory in gallons of synthetic gasoline.